What's up everybody? I am Mr. Cheebs. There are a lot of explosions tutorials on YouTube, but there aren't too many that really just focus on how to shape an explosion to get the specific shape that you want. Now, I say explosions just for mainly clickbait, but really this is just for MantaFlow smoke in general. I would recommend having a bit of background knowledge on MantaFlow. I did make an entire tutorial series on the subject if you want to check that out. And other than that, let's get into it. All smoke simulations start with a flow object to introduce volumes into the scene. In some simulations this can be pretty cut and dry, but in most situations you'll want to put a bit of thought into how you're using the flow object for the simulation's look. With basic mesh emitters you can shape the simulation purely through the shape of the mesh. Now if you leave your flow object as a basic smooth sphere, you'll likely get a symmetrical and simplistic simulation. But if you duplicate all of those vertices in edit mode and move it a little bit, you'll be able to start shaping things out and adding distinct smoke plumes. Up until this point I've been using the geometry flow behavior, but now I'm going to switch over to inflow so we can animate this object. With this simulation I've started with a very small scale and then animated it blowing up over a couple of frames. I've also keyframed the surface and volume emission settings to taper off as this scales. The result is this fast growing explosion cloud. Now, at this point there's just one main thing holding us back, the fact that it looks like a scaling smoke cloud. We've added a bit of motion by doing this animation, but what we need to do now is give MantaFlow a bit more control. That way it'll start looking like an actual smoke sim instead of just a controlled mesh. The first thing we can do is give MantaFlow a better starting point. If we vary up our mesh a little, that will make it less modeled. We can achieve this through a myriad of ways, but I find that using a displace modifier with a basic clouds texture does the trick. Now that's slightly better, but obviously it's still pretty bad. If we edit some things to give MantaFlow even more control at the beginning, our simulation can look better. The best way to do this is through the initial velocity settings under our flow object. The best thing here is that we don't even have to do all that much. Our object is already animated, so long as we toggle that on and leave the source velocity at 1, then our smoke will inherit all the scaling motion from our flow object. That one change makes things work pretty great as it's inheriting the velocity and the smoke is actually moving. We could change some domain settings if we wanted, but this does look pretty great. Just remember that the initial velocity, the shape of the mesh, and the animation are all really useful for your flow object. You can use that for large billows, small spires, pretty much any shape that you can model, you can use this to get that shape of the explosion. Particles happen to be our second option for flow objects. I don't use them as often as meshes are far easier to control and get a shape out of, but, particles do have some use cases. The first way we can shape particles is by simply applying them to an already prepared mesh emitter. If we use inherited source velocity as we did before for the smoke, we can get nice particle motion too. Remember to not use too much source velocity or randomization though, because if you go too far, this will become formless and very fuzzy. Meshes are usually easier to work with for these large forms, so I usually just use them, but applying particles like this can give you a bit of variation if it's stylistically what you're looking for. For some specific shapes, particles are way easier to use though. For example, this debris falling in these few distinct spheres. For these bits of trailing smoke, particles can work really great because you don't have to hand animate and try to figure out how things are going to look. If you just emit a few of them coming off of a shaped plane, then you can get a really nice look from this just by using it as a basic inflow object. They can be okay in other situations, but I personally don't use particles too often, just because they're harder to shape than a mesh. They can give some variance, but you also can achieve that with a mesh pretty easily. So ultimately, falling debris, embers, and thin smoke trails are my main use case for particles. Force objects can also be used to great effect, but I don't really love using them for the main motion of a simulation, and that's because they are rather abstract. Making a simulation over and over while tweaking these little values on your force objects is a great way to just waste a lot of time and not get your desired result. Just think of force objects as subtle little helpers for some extra motion, not as the main driving force for your simulation. Wind force fields are pretty useful for adding a bit of life, just something to make the smoke drift as it moves upward and dispels. Another object that is pretty useful is the force object. Setting the strength to a positive value will push smoke away, and setting this in the right spot can help expand mushroom clouds and prominent smoke billows. And the last main force object that can be pretty dang useful is the turbulence force field. This can be used to add some variance to the smoke as it throws random motion across the entire scene. With force objects, it's very important to remember that less is more. Don't overcomplicate things. If a problem can't be made better with a single force object, you're likely just going to make it worse if you add even more. The more force objects you have, the more values you have to tweak, which means more time spent baking data, and potentially a lot more time wasted. Lastly, let's talk about some good practices for more efficient simulation creation. Always prioritize the visual language and the shape of your simulation first. Try to nail larger shapes at a lower resolution and gradually increase the resolution of the simulation as it gets more complex and the detail level increases. If your sim doesn't look good at a middle to lower resolution, it likely won't look any better with a higher res. One practice that I've found really helpful is compartmentalizing my simulations with multiple domains. You can select collections in the domain settings so that a specific domain only uses fluid and force objects from a specific collection. By doing this, you can work on individual parts of a sim without worrying about the rest of everything being affected. This is also useful for a faster iteration time, as you don't have to worry about the whole sim being calculated, just the specific parts and flow objects within that domain. In practice, this would look something like having a domain for the main billows, a domain for smaller fallout objects, and a domain for a ground shockwave. As for making your simulation look finalized and polished, I'd find that baked noise goes a really long way. Just toggling that on and baking it out can take a simulation from looking like wispy garbage to an absolute chad of a smoke plume. The visual style can be largely impacted as well due to the scale of the noise. Remember that a lower scale means higher frequency detail, and a larger scale means lower frequency detail and more shapes. Depending on the other detail methods you've messed with, such as the vorticity value or turbulence fields, you may want to change the scale on the noise. Either way, I would always recommend baking this noise out and make your simulation look final. If you guys have any other advice for how to shape smoke simulations, go ahead and leave it right down there in the comments section. If you want to help out the channel, check me out at Patreon, that's the first link in the description. And I want to thank Matt, Terry Davis, Stephen D. Swanee, Justin Oliver, Don Hopkins, Susan Uncle, and Atomic Alpha for supporting me over there. Thank you to everyone who watched this, give it a like and subscribe if it helped you out, and have a great day.